We often hear that a multipolar world is emerging and the unipolar world is fading. What does this really mean? The idea of countries dealing with each other as equals is at loggerheads with the notion that one great power should rule the whole planet. But what is a pole? Interestingly, the idea of polarity is first found in medicine, where it describes neurons transferring information throughout the body. Political scientists borrowed this term to describe international relations, where pole means a great power. The earliest use of the term was in a book by William T. R. Fox in 1944, in which he spoke of a bipolar world. Fox was a highly influential professor of foreign policy and international relations at Columbia University. He also coined the term superpower. Fox's students, such as Kenneth N. Waltz and Morton Kaplan, would go on to fully theorize about polarity. After the Second World War, and picking up on Fox's use of this term, scholars began to refer to the world as bipolar, and they began to talk about the phenomenon of bipolarity. By this they meant that when the Second World War ended, the planet had two dominant poles, two great and rival powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. This rivalry came to a head in 1949 when America created NATO, whose purpose was to defend against purported Soviet aggression. The Soviets, in turn, responded with the Warsaw Pact, a defense alliance of various socialist countries in Eurasia. Thus began the Cold War, which would last for the next 50 years. In the West, the notion of bipolarity further led to the terms, the First World, which meant countries in NATO, the Second World, which meant the countries of the Warsaw Pact, and the Third World, which meant countries not allied with either, that is, countries which remained neutral. Only later did the terms, First World, and Third World take on a positive and pejorative meaning. Just as a magnet has two poles, north and south, with each attracting objects to it, so also the world, it was said, was divided between two great powers, American and Soviet, with each attracting and holding in its zone of influence various countries of the world. Such was the logic of the Cold War, in which one power sought dominance over the other. In the word of Joseph Nogi, a pole, like the magnet from which the metaphor comes, must both repel and attract, i.e., it must be engaged in widespread politics of rivalry as well as cooperation. When the Soviet Union ended in 1991, the United States decided that it had won the Cold War because it was the sole great power now in the world. Therefore, the United States was also a superpower, which had no rival in the world. This understanding was summarized by Charles Krauthammer, a neoconservative, who famously declared that America had entered the unipolar moment, meaning that the destiny of the world was a perpetual, universal, American civilization. This triumph was also called the end of history, since the American way was the eternal way, which alone could guarantee peace and stability for the entire planet. Without American unipolarity, there was only chaos. Outside of American civilization, there was only barbarity. And so, America expected the world to cluster around it, since the world now had only one pole, one great power. Here, it is crucial to note that while the Soviet Union dissolved the Warsaw Pact, America held on to, and even strengthened and expanded, NATO, which remains an efficient tool of global American influence. In the words of the National Security Strategy of 1998, as we approach the beginning of the 21st century, the United States remains the world's most powerful force for peace, prosperity, and the universal values of democracy and freedom. Our nation's challenge, and our responsibility, is to sustain that role by harnessing the forces of global integration for the benefit of our own people and people around the world. This, in effect, is the New World Order, dispensed by America, the indispensable nation. In such a view of itself, America also claimed to be the inventor of democracy, the market economy and free trade, all three of which it said had won the world over to the side of America. But it can also be said that the global capital market is equivalent to a crushing victory of capital over ordinary people, which means that there is no more democracy. Therefore, America demanded that countries cluster around it to thwart chaos. A cluster is the tight bonding of many states around a single, great power, by way of networks, finance, economics, alliances, trade, NGOs, aid transactions, military alliances, and a general cooperative understanding, such as a shared ideology. Those outside America, however, called unipolarity by another name, hegemony. The term hegemony means having a predominant influence on all countries of the world, small and big, so that none of them have true sovereignty, since they can only obey the great power. The American self-declaration of being the sole superpower of the world placed Russia in an existential quandary. When the Soviet Union dissolved, all through the 1990s, America set about breaking up the former USSR into many smaller countries. The purpose of this dismemberment was twofold: first, to ensure that the newly created post-Soviet states, being small and weak, would naturally cluster around America, which could then freely manage them and their rich resources. Second, to ensure that Russia could never again become a pole, a rival great power. The American plan thus was to render Russia a weak rump state, good only for clustering around the USA, since it would have no ability to become independent and sovereign. The wholesale dismemberment was halted when President Putin came to power, and he has been hated by America for this ever since, and every effort has been made to remove him, because his vision for Russia clashes with American ambitions for Eurasia. However, President Putin's aim was not to revive the bipolarity of the Cold War, which was based on rivalry. Instead, he spoke of the multipolar world, by which he meant that the world had the inherent right to manage its own affairs, free from American threats and military actions, and that each nation should be left free to pursue whatever path it wished to follow. In other words, there could not be a global American civilization. President Putin reasoned that when the bipolar Cold War ended, it gave countries sovereignty, that is, freedom of action. And these independent countries now had little appetite for clustering around a great power, and assuming a subservient role. This remains President Putin's vision to this day, and this is why the West deeply hates him, because he works to maintain and strengthen a Russia that America sees as an unbeatable rival. But what does multipolar or multipolarity mean? And is it achievable? Very simply, multipolar means that all international relations, economic, financial, cultural and ideological, are determined by what is best for each nation, in the areas of economics, geographical priorities, cultural and religious structures, traditions, as well as military organization. Multipolarity further means that the world can potentially have many great powers, each of which can exert influence in its own way. In fact, for most of human history, there was multipolarity, where many great powers learned to live with each other, so that there was a balance both of influence and authority, despite conflicts. After 1945, this global structure changed drastically with the rise of America. Multipolarity effectively creates the context for a new method of international relations, one of equals existing among equals, whereas unipolarity demands subservience to America and the full adoption of whatever America deems is its civilization, the code word for which is democracy. This is why the go-to American international strategy is violence, threats, intimidation, economic sanctions, military actions, regime changes, color revolutions, assaults on tradition, undermining of national cultures, psychological warfare, all of which are well-designed mechanisms that America uses to maintain and further its dominance. In his speech at the Munich Security Conference, in 2007, President Putin stated that unipolarity was, without moral foundations for modern civilization. Here is what he said. What is a unipolar world? However one might embellish this term, it refers to one type of situation, namely one center of authority, one center of force, one center of decision-making. It is a world in which there is one master, one sovereign. This is pernicious not only for all those within this system, but also for the sovereign itself because it destroys itself from within. And this certainly has nothing in common with democracy. Because, as you know, democracy is the power of the majority in light of the interests and opinions of the minority. I consider that the unipolar model is not only unacceptable but also impossible in today's world. The model itself is flawed because at its basis there is and can be no moral foundations for modern civilization. By this he meant that clustering is no longer an option for any nation, that American civilization can never be a planetary one because it is fundamentally immoral. Rather, each country, each region should build its own civilization, based upon its own history, culture, beliefs, and tradition. Such things cannot be imported, or transplanted, from America to Build Back Better. In other words, the world cannot and should not mirror America, and America should stop trying to erect such mirrors throughout the world. For this vision, President Putin continues to be reviled by the power holders of the West, who cannot imagine a world without American dominance, or rather, it is to their economic benefit not to imagine one. And therefore, President Putin is smeared as the eternal enemy, the consummate barbarian, the perpetual outsider, in short, a dictator, whom America must hate, because it is the mission of America to topple dictators. But let us step back a little and take a look at what all this means. Despite President Putin's best efforts, more and more, it would appear that we have returned to a bipolarity, where there are nations who prefer to cluster around America, and others that have begun to cluster around a new power bloc, a new pole, that of Russia and its allies, and this alliance is expressed in BRICS. Those nations that cluster around the United States still believe that America can guarantee them stability and economic prosperity, a bright future inside American civilization. This Faustian bargain stems from that notion of Krauthammer, in that they believe that America's unipolar moment is eternal and is therefore the true destiny of the world. In other words, the manifest destiny gone global. To gain entry into this planetary civilization requires the full and complete adoption of the American way of life, which means that the global community must become consumers of products produced by multinational corporations. This alone can ensure democracy, the market economy, and free trade. America requires total transformation, a world filled with mini-Americas. Such is America's missionary zeal. On the other hand, countries that cluster around Russia are not asked to become Russian, let alone take on Russian civilization. Instead, what Russia offers are economic structures in which other nations can engage, for the benefit of all. Each nation thus retains its identity and sovereignty. Russia does not demand the creation of mini-Russias. But all this also raises an important question: can other poles, other great powers emerge out of multipolarity, which seems to be what the term multipolar suggests, that is, many great powers? Can a state that is clustered around a great power itself become a great power, a pole all its own, through economic association with Russia? For example, can India become a pole, where other nations will want to cluster around it? Can an African nation form into a pole? Can Japan or any of the Arab states? And is it preferable and advantageous for some countries to simply cluster and not be concerned about being polar, since polarity contains within it the seeds of rivalry? And since Russia has become a pole, and won back the status of a great power, a new era of bipolarity has again begun, in that the world again has two great, rival powers, America and Russia? And all the countries of the world are indeed aligning with one or the other. Since polarity is about influence and authority, both of which can lead to rivalry and competition, although it does not have to be this way. All this means that the way ahead is difficult, and international relations of the future will involve much struggle, for America will not easily accept a loss of status, nor is it happy that Russia is again powerful, which was and is the point of the war in the Ukraine. But can America itself change its understanding of power? Can it learn to let go its habit of dominating others via military and economic might? Old habits die hard, as they say. And because America can no longer dominate Russia, the best that America can do is increase the rivalry and make life tough for Russia, hence the 16,000 sanctions currently now in place against Russia, an expanding war, more sanctions and more anti-Russia propaganda. In other words, broader conflict. And if multipolarity indeed succeeds in creating many great powers, will these powers not then seek dominance over one another and thus again reach for unipolarity? As a famous philosopher observed, power corrupts. Multipolarity therefore means a long, new Cold War, America against Russia and then America against China. And should multipolarity create many great powers, then there is further room for conflict and war, for it will be America against those other poles as well. There is that other old American saying, never go down without a fight. Multipolarity promises peace, but the path ahead is filled with much upheaval and many conflicts.